Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into and demystify a totally massive, absolutely fascinating topic, the sociology and history of the Indian diaspora. We are going to journey through centuries of history, millions of people, and constantly shifting borders. By the time we wrap up, you'll have a completely new framework for understanding exactly how global communities form, adapt, and ultimately define what it means to be home. So let's just get right into it. Here is our roadmap for today's zoom in, zoom out journey. We'll be covering 3 waves of migration, 5 lenses of diaspora, evolving decades of research, civilizations and settlement societies, roots and multiple territorialization, and finally, imagining the homeland. Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1. 3 waves of migration, the big picture of human movement. The sheer historical scale we're talking about here is pretty mind-blowing. Way back in the ancient and medieval eras, you had kings and traders expanding out to the Middle East and Southeast Asia, creating what's sometimes called a Greater India. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we see a massive colonial wave that literally moved millions of indentured laborers out to global plantations. And finally, the modern wave, which is all about post-independence migration to the West and oil-rich Gulf nations. Now, what's crucial to remember here is that scholars argue this contemporary wave is still deeply, deeply connected to that 19th century colonial history. And that connection brings us straight into post-colonialism. This is essentially the study of how identity forms after colonial rule officially ends. It looks at how those lingering us versus them ideas, where historically the colonizer was framed as rational and the colonized as merely emotional, how those ideas continue to echo in culture and politics today. You literally cannot separate the modern Indian diaspora from its colonial roots, because those old historical power dynamics are still actively shaping identities right now. Moving on to Section 2, 5 lenses of diaspora, the scholar's toolkit. So because the diaspora is so incredibly vast, there isn't just one single story to tell. Scholars use 5 main lenses to make sense of it all. The economic lens looks at investments, and it's done this really fascinating rebrand, turning the idea of skilled emigration from a brain drain into global brain banks. The literary lens explores contested identities. The demographic lens is all about the numbers, though estimates swing wildly from 8.6 to 19 million, depending entirely on who is doing the counting. The geographic lens maps out 6 distinct world zones. And finally, the anthropological lens asks how living across borders fundamentally reshapes a person's identity. Critic Tejaswini Niranjana actually hits the nail on the head when illustrating that literary and cultural lens. She points out that a Gujarati identity built on a colonial-era plantation in Trinidad or Fiji is just as valid and just as Indian as the identity of an NRI professional working in the Gulf today. Both are entirely authentic. They're just being dynamically reshaped by completely different global contexts. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Let's call it the cricket test. Political scientist Benedict Anderson studies something called long-distance nationalism. So if you're a migrant, which team do you cheer for when your homeland plays your new host country? It's a great question, right? Well, it rarely yields a simple answer. A migrant's loyalty shifts dynamically, depending on the context. Sometimes a regional or religious identity totally outweighs the national one. It just goes to show that identity is never one-dimensional. Section 3. Evolving decades of research, shifting academic perspectives. It's really interesting to see how academic research on this has dramatically evolved over just 30 years. In the 1960s, the focus was purely on cultural persistence, basically looking at how East Indians in Trinidad kept their ancestral customs alive in almost a vacuum. But by the 1970s, studies on Tamil workers in Malaysia shifted the focus to adaptation. How do you keep those customs while adjusting to a new environment? Then, by the 1980s, studies on Gujarati Patidars in London brought in the idea of strategic choice. These were twice migrants who had moved from India to East Africa and then to the UK, and they were actively using their global networks to succeed. The overarching takeaway here is absolutely crucial. Academia completely shifted its view. They moved from assuming culture merely survives, completely unchanged, to studying how it adapts, to finally treating ethnicity as something that is actively built and strategized. Ethnicity isn't some fixed artifact you put behind glass in a museum. It's a social boundary that people construct every single day through their decisions. That brings us to Section 4, Civilizations and Settlement Societies, Clashing Concepts. Think of these as 2 highly distinct types of geographic identities. On one side, you have settlement societies, places like the USA or South Africa. They have relatively shorter histories, colonial pasts, and their identities are heavily tied to massive immigration and market-driven ethnic interactions. On the flip side, you have civilizations, places like India or China. These feature old, deep-rooted traditions and a long shared history that forms a common cultural will. But keep in mind, these aren't just isolated opposites. For example, the UK is a very old civilizational state, but today it actually contains a massive diasporic settlement society right within its own borders. To really grasp how these societies functioned historically, we have to look at Furnival's concept of a plural society. Imagine different ethnic groups living side by side but barely sharing any common values. They interact strictly in the marketplace, doing business, but they're only held together by a colonial authority. In short, they mix, but they definitely don't blend. It's exactly how colonial powers managed super diverse populations without ever bothering to foster a true shared civilizational will. Section 5. Roots and Multiple Territorialization. The Universe of Discourse. Okay, so if we zoom out, scholars generally fall into an intellectual battleground between two main poles. Pole A represents a postmodern mood, linked to late capitalism in those settlement societies we just talked about, where culture is seen as fragmented. Pole B is the modernist mood, linked to early capitalism in civilizations, which really values tradition and rootedness. The defining difference between these two camps all boils down to their sense of place. So Pole A believes in this concept called deterritorialization. This is a very abstract, postmodern idea. It argues that in our highly globalized world, your identity is completely unhooked from any specific geography. A diasporic person is seen as rootless. They have these global loyalties, meaning they kind of belong everywhere and nowhere, all at the same time. Now contrast that abstract idea with Pole B, multiple territorialization. Instead of saying people are rootless, this argues for multi-rootedness. It means people have very concrete ties to several places at once. You might have an economic tie to India, legal citizenship in the UK, and deep cultural ties to one specific village. And honestly, the research leans heavily toward this multiple territorialization lens. Why? Because it lets scholars study real, tangible things. You can't really measure an abstract feeling of belonging nowhere, but you absolutely can measure family investments and immigration policies. And finally, Section 6, Imagining the Homeland, the Emotional Core. You know, governments love putting people into neat little boxes. We have NRIs, citizens living abroad, and PIOs, foreign citizens of Indian origin. Legally speaking, it's a very neat split, but culturally, it's practically meaningless. Because whether you hold an Indian passport or a Canadian one, your cultural identity is being shaped by the exact same sweeping forces of post-coloniality and globalization. Now, what's really interesting here is how this dynamic perfectly captures what scholar William Safran calls a homing instinct. Diaspora communities constantly relate back to their homeland. But there's a fascinating twist. The diaspora tends to view India highly emotionally, as an imaginary homeland, almost frozen in time and nostalgia. Meanwhile, Indians who are actually living in India view the diaspora in a much more practical, economic light, an imagined diaspora of wealth and success. It is the exact same relationship, just viewed from two completely different vantage points. Of course, we got to ground this in reality. Diaspora communities are absolutely not utopias. There is very real evidence of resistance movements fighting against racism and gender discrimination in host countries. That struggle is a very real part of the history. However, if we look at the overarching global trend, the majority of these communities demonstrate a broadly peaceful, kind of fit-in-and-get-on-with-it style of settler citizenship. They adopt, they build, and they contribute to their new homes. So, we've covered a lot today. We've seen that culture doesn't just passively survive. It adapts and is strategically built. We've seen that people aren't rootless in a globalized world. They are deeply multi-rooted. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If your identity is shaped by concrete economic, legal, and cultural ties to multiple territories at once, what truly defines your homeland today? Thank you so much for exploring this with me.